The last phase of judgment before Christ's return is happening now. The treading of the winepress, as expressed in the vision of Revelation 14, is already underway. The judgment of the living is coming to an end, and Jesus' coming is right around the corner. If this is indeed true, we must have a solid biblical understanding upon which we can trust, and this is exactly what God has provided for such a critical theme of the judgment that touches everyone in an up-close and personal way. Everyone that claims the name of Christ wants to be gathered by Him as His fruit, but the enemy of souls also wants to destroy the harvest, so it is imperative to understand his schemes and how to avoid becoming part of those who are trodden in the winepress. The study of Revelation 14 is the key to understanding the theme of the judgment. The latter part of this chapter has been a mystery for Bible scholars, but now, at the end of time, God makes it plain for everyone to understand and be brought to a point of decision. This video will open your eyes to how the prophecies of this chapter are coming to pass and how we are at the very end. Please watch the video entitled, "Will Jesus Come Now?", which gives the broad historical context to the time of the judgment. The judgment consists of two phases. First is the judgment of the dead, which is described in Revelation 14 in terms of the three angels' messages. The first angel's message indicates the beginning of the judgment hour, saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come, and worship Him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters." The judgment of the dead continues all the way to verse 13. "And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them." You can read about this hour of the judgment of the dead in detail in the Orion presentation at lastcountdown.org. It corresponds to the judgment cycle of God's clock in Orion. It is not new knowledge that those verses pertain to the judgment of the dead, but the rest of the chapter that describes the final harvest has only recently been understood, and now it is presented to you through this video. While the harvest was in progress, the White Cloud Farm Ministry wrote many articles about it, all of which contain guiding truth according to what was happening in the harvest at those times. Only now, at the conclusion of the harvest, however, has the entire picture become clear in retrospect. It is the Lord's intention that we look back and understand what has transpired. And now I have told you before it come to pass, that when it is come to pass, ye might believe. The harvest represents the judgment of the living, a time in which God's people were to be gathered. In God's clock in Orion, the harvest time consists of the 7 cycles of judgment that follow the main judgment cycle that corresponds to the judgment of the dead. The judgment of the dead was itself a warning of the impending judgment of the living. And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God." Each of the texts for the final harvest found in Revelation 14:14-20 describe one phase of the harvest, which can be correlated to each of the 7 cycles of God's clock that followed after the main judgment cycle. As we look back to each cycle, we can see how the events of each one transpired in perfect time with God's clock. Hold on to your seat and witness the perfect outworking of God's timing as we examine the evidence. The first verse pertaining to the judgment of the living speaks in the symbolism of the second coming of Jesus. "And I looked, and behold a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle." This sets the stage for the harvest. and the angel introduced here is none other than Orion as a symbol for Jesus. He is the Lord of the harvest, and therefore it is his clock that depicts the times and events transpiring in the cycles of the solemn time of the harvest. The first cycle of the harvest, or judgment of the living, is the preparatory trumpet cycle, which began on February 1, 2014. You can read about the trumpet warnings for this time in the Last Battle section of lastcountdown.org. The next angel comes on the scene in the next clock cycle and in the next verse, but because he holds a dialogue with the first angel, it can no longer be Jesus himself. It is another angel like him. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, "Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe." Notice that this angel calls for the harvest to be reaped, but so far the reaping has not taken place. This phase of the harvest corresponds to the preparatory plague cycle of the Orion clock, which ended in the autumn of 2016, when the last countdown ministry ended, and the sacrifice of Philadelphia initiated the White Cloud Farm ministry in its place. That experience of the people of God was highly significant because they had interceded for more time, prizing the souls of others above their own salvation, thus demonstrating the sacrificial character of Jesus. You can read the entire momentous story on whitecloudfarm.org to learn how time was granted by God in answer to their petition. After that self-sacrificing character was demonstrated, we see that the next harvest verse describes the reaping of the grain. "And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped." This corresponds to the loud trumpet cycle, a time when trumpet after trumpet fulfilled in an unmistakable way that even the world could recognize. You can read about this in the section Prophecies Fulfilled on whitecloudfarm.org. This critical phase of the judgment of the living saw all those who did not make a complete sacrifice in 2016 fall away, and it was thus also seen who stood the test. The ones who stood with Jesus are represented as the 144,000 at the beginning of Revelation 14, who follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. When the plagues began on August 20, 2018, the associated clock cycle fulfilled the next verse, which depicts Jesus again, the one who executes vengeance. "And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle." The sickle of Leo in the Father's clock, the Mazzaroth, even figured heavily into the heavenly signs for this cycle, which represents the first phase of the harvest of the wicked. The child sex abuse scandal that plagued the Catholic Church, especially at that time, is evidence that it was indeed time to harvest the wicked. "And another angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, Thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe." Once again, another angel is introduced, which the conversation shows cannot be Jesus. These two angels are the harvesters, as it says in Matthew 13:39. But this time, this auxiliary angel is said to have come from the altar and to have had power over fire. This refers first of all to the acceptable sacrifice of Philadelphia that was made in 2016, the altar, and to the identity of this angel as the antitypical Elijah who had power over fire. Thus, in the thunder cycle, he is represented as calling for the grapes to be gathered. The next phase of the harvest marked the time for the gathering of the grapes according to the closing cycle, which began on January 20, 2020. "And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God." It was at this time that the coronavirus crisis began, and through it the world was gathered together and cast into the winepress. But there is one more phase, which corresponds to the next and last clock cycle called the victory cycle, which began on October 5, 2020, with the plague of the coronavirus vaccine beginning almost immediately. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. During the victory cycle, the vaccine has gone from clinical trials to vaccination of the masses. This is the treading of the winepress, the great delusion and the wrath of God upon those who are not hiding in their chambers, according to Isaiah, waiting for their salvation from the Horsehead Nebula, signified by the horse bridles, as explained in the article, It is the Lord. Those who fall by receiving the vaccine are outside the city, outside Zion, as indicated chiastically in verse 1. They are lost forever. The judgment of the living is a solemn time. Watch the decree of death for deeper understanding. By contrast, the ones who stand on Mount Zion are the ones who sing the song of sacrifice, the sacrifice of Philadelphia made in 2016. You can read about that in the opening article series on whitecloudfarm.org. These are the 144,000. And I looked, and lo, a Lamb stood on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having the Father's name written in their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. And they sung as it were a new song before the throne, and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the firstfruits unto God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. These redeemed ones are the firstfruits of grain from the first part of the final harvest. And now you can know for sure whether you belong to the 144,000 or not. Do you have the self-sacrificing attitude that characterizes one who is Christ-like? Have you learned the song of the harpers? Do you understand how Jesus' return was delayed by sacrificial love for your sake? Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Now there is no more delay, and the winepress is already being trodden. Will you demonstrate Christ's sacrificial character in the last great test by refusing the DNA-altering COVID vaccination, despite the loss of friends and family, employment, and every earthly support? Soon the victory cycle will be over, and as mentioned in the video, will Jesus come now? The time granted for delay ends with this cycle, when the treading of the winepress will be finished. The judgment of the living is ending, but until it does, there is still a little time to reach the garner of God, even in these last moments before the Lord's return. May you be counted with the increase of His harvest. Thank you for watching our channel, and we're glad you enjoyed this video. We have many other exciting videos in production about brand new topics that have never before been made public in their entirety. To be notified when every new video is released, please join our official Telegram group called the Alnitak Newsletter by following the invite link on our homepage at whitecloudfarm.org. Please share it with your friends as well. Thank you, and may God bless you as you help spread His light.